What is a human being? It is the ultimate question to which institutional science offers surprising answers. The materialistic paradigm, which has dominated institutional science for well over a century, states that the essence of consciousness can be reduced to the physical components of the brain. As physicist Stephen Hawking states, "I think the brain is essentially a computer, and consciousness is like a computer program. It will cease to run when the computer is turned off." Perhaps this perspective is conveyed most vividly in evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins' description of human beings as, quote, lumbering robots. If human beings are robots or computers, then all we take for granted about personal identity must be radically reassessed. However, does an alternative scientific perspective exist? One of the most remarkable researchers into consciousness and the evolution of life is biologist Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. Dr. Sheldrake is the author of more than 80 scientific papers and 10 books. He has won international acclaim for his experimental research on his hypothesis of morphic fields and morphic resonance. We asked Dr. Sheldrake for his thoughts on consciousness, beginning with the question, has the theory that consciousness is confined to and generated by the brain been proven scientifically?
Well, the standard view within science is not so much based on the findings of science, but on a pre-existing philosophy, and that philosophy is called scientific materialism. That philosophy says that matter is the only reality in the universe, and therefore mind or consciousness must be a product of matter, because matter is the primary reality. So our brains are the source of consciousness, and the mental activity is nothing but brain activity. But mental activity doesn't interact with the brain. It doesn't actually do anything. It's either a meaningless shadow or epiphenomenon of brain activity, or it's another way of talking about brain activity, a kind of folk psychology way of talking about brain activity, or else the brain somehow creates the illusion of consciousness. Now, of course, these are highly disputed positions in the world of philosophy. Most mainstream philosophers in the English-speaking world are materialists, so they adopt one of those three positions, but they don't agree among themselves as to which is the better one. And so the arguments between the materialist philosophers are really about the best way of dismissing or ignoring consciousness or explaining it away. So that is the mainstream view, and that's why within the recent BRAIN project in the European Union and in the US, the attempt to understand human consciousness focuses exclusively on the brain and on nervous activity in the brain and nervous connections, because as far as they're concerned, that's all there is to it. Even free will is an illusion from the point of view of this materialist philosophy, which sets the orthodox tone in academia. We know that the brain is related to consciousness. I mean, people have known that since ancient times. You know, a blow on the head can cause concussion and the temporary removal of consciousness. Drugs can affect consciousness through their physical effects or chemical effects. And people have known about alcohol and hallucinogens and shamanic psychedelics for centuries or millennia. So people have known that the brain is in some way involved and the body's involved, but the idea that it's nothing but the brain is simply an assumption. I mean, it's a bit like the familiar analogy of the TV set. So obviously the wires and transistors in the TV set play an important part in producing the pictures on the screen, but no one would suppose that the television program you're watching on the TV set is nothing but the material components of the TV set. Obviously, they're important. Damage the TV set, and you can damage the picture or the sounds. This leaves open the question as to whether there's more than just the material part of the brain. And all traditional views of consciousness have thought that there is more than just the brain or just the body involved in consciousness. Although most people assume that it's been proved by science that consciousness is nothing but the brain, they don't really follow through on that assumption, because if consciousness is nothing but the brain and it's all determined by physical causes, then you don't have any free will. And Our entire educational system, our entire legal system, our entire system of responsibility depends on the idea that people have freedom of choice. If everyone does what they do because their brain makes it do them, then they can't really be convicted of a crime because they couldn't have done otherwise. They couldn't have chosen not to do it. Yet our entire system depends on this belief in free choice, and indeed, especially in the United States, there's a huge emphasis on individual freedom of choice, and that is completely contrary to this materialist assumption that we don't have free will, it's nothing but physical causation in the brain.
Science headlines today suggest that human consciousness may one day be able to be uploaded onto computers. This hypothesis is based on the notion that all memory is physically stored in the brain, a premise that, Dr. Sheldrake tells us, remains unproven.
Well, that is a very standard assumption. If you have a materialist assumption that the mind is nothing but matter, that the mind is the brain, then memory, which is part of the functioning of the mind, must be in the brain too, and it must be stored materially. And most people in the common sense world accept that too. I mean, most people would say, well, where else could it be? But as I show in my book, Science Set Free, the idea that memories are stored in the brain is, again, an assumption. And for more than 100 years, people have been trying to find memory stores in brains, and they simply haven't been able to. It's assumed that they must be stored as modified nerve endings or phosphorylated proteins or something. Everything you remember about your holiday this year, or an episode from your childhood, or anything else you remember, must be somewhere inside your brain. A variety of philosophers have criticized that point of view for years. One criticism is that if you have a memory store in the brain, then to retrieve the memory, you have to have a memory retrieval system. But for the memory retrieval system to recognize the memory it's retrieving, it has to have a memory itself. And so you get into an infinite regress. So the memory storage system runs into terrible philosophical problems. But worst of all, it's made predictions that have been refuted over and over again by the failure to find localized memory traces. The failure to find memories of particular places has led some scientists to think that they must be stored holographically over large regions of the brain. But I think it's more likely they're not stored in the brain at all, that the brain's more like a TV receiver than a video recorder. The brain tunes into memories, and they depend on a process I call morphic resonance, an influence from the past on the basis of similarity. The reason that we tune into our own memories is because we're more similar to ourselves in the past than to anyone else. But I think we also tune into lots of other memories from other people, kind of collective memories, as Jung said in his idea of the collective unconscious, and that we tune into other people by resonance too, but it's less specific than our own memories, so it's a more generalized, largely unconscious collective memory. Now let me add one more thing about the scientific findings. The resonance theory of memory I'm putting forward says that memories would occur when particular activity in the brain occurs, that this would resonate with similar activity in the past. Now, one thing that brain sciences have established is that certain memories depend on activity in particular regions of the brain when they're being laid down or when they're being recalled. Now, that fits very well with the resonance theory. You'd expect particular patterns of activity when memories are being laid down or when they're being recalled. The problem with the memory storage in memory traces is that in between the period when the memory is laid down and the memory is recalled, they just seem to disappear. And that's where there are supposed to be these mysterious storage systems in the brain that no one's actually located. And I think the reason that people haven't found them is because they're not there.
Self-styled skeptics repeat the mantra, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Yet it remains unclear just how extraordinary the standards must be to prove psychic phenomena. We asked Dr. Sheldrake to describe in detail his experimental research, published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, into telepathy in both humans and animals.
Well, there are people who call themselves skeptics, and they're really kind of scientific fundamentalists, who think telepathy is impossible because the mind's nothing but the brain. That's their assumption. They think it's true, but it's actually just a hypothesis that doesn't fit the facts very well. And on the basis that the mind's nothing but the brain, they think that the mental activity is inside the head, and therefore you can't have any effect of thoughts or intentions or feelings at a distance, which is what telepathy is about. For people like that, all the evidence has to be flawed, or it has to be dismissed, because otherwise they'd have to change their view of the world. So there's a denial movement that's very firmly entrenched in the academic scientific world. And the people that I meet who say it doesn't exist, there's no repeatable evidence for this, and so on, when I ask them, have you actually looked at the evidence, turns out they haven't. They've just sort of taken this on trust. I myself took the line when I got interested in telepathy in the 1980s. I took the line that if telepathy exists, it's likely to have evolved. It's likely to be a natural phenomenon, not just some peculiar feature of humans, but something that's part of our animal nature. So I looked into telepathy in animals, and I found that no one had actually done that before. It wasn't that people had tried it and it hadn't worked. It just hadn't been tried. And I found there was a lot of evidence that telepathy seemed to occur with the animals we know best: dogs, cats, horses, parrots, other domestic animals, and animals that we domesticate, like the horse and so on. So, first of all, I collected a huge database. I have thousands of case histories, observations of animals that suggest they might be picking up thoughts or intentions. For example, we have more than 200 cases of cats where their owners say their cat seems to pick up their intention to take the cat to the vet, and the cat hides. And this gets very annoying for people, because when they want to take the cat to the vet, they can't find it. So they try to avoid letting it see in the carrying basket, or they try to avoid mentioning the word vet. But the cat still seems to know. We did a survey of vets in North London that showed that 64 out of 65 had a recurrent problem with people missing appointments because they couldn't find the cat. And the one exception said it happened so often they'd given up the appointment system for cats. The one I've looked at most is that many people say that their dog or cat knows when a member of the family is coming home, and it goes to wait at a door or a window when they're on the way. And so I discussed this with some of my scientific friends and some of my skeptical friends, and said, what do you think of this? And they said, oh, well, obviously it's just a matter of the dog reacting at a routine time or hearing a familiar car sound. They didn't deny the phenomenon. In fact, one of my skeptic friends, Nicholas Humphrey, told me that his own dog did this. His mother knew when he was coming home half an hour in advance, even when he came at irregular times. So I said to him, well, your dog couldn't possibly have heard your car from half an hour away, the other side of Cambridge, over many miles, irrespective of the wind direction and with all the other traffic. And he replied, oh, on the contrary, it just shows what sharp hearing they've got. So that gave me the idea for an actual test. So I said to him, well, look, what would happen if you came home at a non-routine time, come on the train, borrow a bicycle, so there's no familiar sounds from cars? Would your dog still know when you were coming? And he said, no. And I said, well, then we can test that. And unfortunately, his dog had died by then, but I found other dogs that do this, and I did experiments where I filmed the place the dog waited the whole time the person was out. So we had a complete videotaped, time-coded record. We had people come home at non-routine times, random times chosen by us. They didn't know in advance when they'd be coming home. We told them by telephone, mobile telephone. And to avoid familiar car sounds, they came home by taxi, in a different taxi each time. And over again, these dogs go and wait at the window 20 minutes, half an hour before the person comes home. And they seem to be responding to their intention to come home, because they'd respond when they called the taxi rather than when they got into it. There's one of these experiments was filmed by Austrian State Television, their science unit, and it's on my website, sheldrake.org. So anyone who wants to see one of these experiments can see it, and all this research is published in peer-reviewed journals. The papers are all online on my website. If anyone wants to look at those, all they're described in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. So I think that is a telepathic phenomenon. The dog is picking up the person's intention. In the human realm, I think very similar things happen. For example, many mothers say that when they were nursing their babies, they might be away from the baby, for example, shopping, or they'd gone back to work after a few months, and then they'd feel their milk let down. Now, the milk let down reflex is an oxytocin hormone-mediated response that normally occurs when the mother hears the baby. It causes the breast to squeeze out milk ready to feed the baby. Many women find their breast tingling when that happens. And a lot of women find that when they're away from the baby, they could be miles away from the baby, they find their milk lets down for no apparent reason. There's no other baby nearby crying or anything. And when that happens, most women assume that their baby needs them because their breasts are telling them. Until recently, they just went home. Now they ring home on a cell phone. And I did a detailed study with 20 nursing mothers in North London, and I found that this milk letdown reflex was correlated extraordinarily well with the baby's distress. The odds against it being a chance coincidence were about 1 billion to 1. I think this is a very basic, fundamental biological form of telepathy. And by far the most common kind of telepathy in the modern world occurs in connection with telephone calls. It happens when people have the experience of thinking of somebody for no apparent reason, then the phone rings and they pick it up and it's that person. They say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you." Or when the phone rings, they just know who it is before they look at the caller ID or answer the phone. Surveys show that over 85% of the population have had that experience. So what's going on there? When I got interested in that, I collected people's stories and I did some surveys of my own on this and found it was very common. So I discussed it with my skeptical friends. And there had been no previous studies on this. So it's not as if this had been studied and refuted. It hadn't been studied, even though this phenomenon has been going on ever since telephones were invented more than 100 years ago. And what the skeptics said, and still say, is, "Oh, well, that's just a coincidence. You think about people all the time, and if someone rings, then you imagine it's telepathy. But you just forget the millions of times you're wrong." So that's not an unreasonable hypothesis. So then I say to my skeptic friends, "Well, have you got any evidence for this hypothesis?" And they look a bit blank. And of course they haven't, because nobody had done any research on it. So this was an evidence-free hypothesis. Now, in science, you need more than an evidence-free hypothesis. You need actual evidence. So I devised a test for telephone telepathy, which I've now done with many people. And the basic test works as follows. If somebody says they're telepathic and can tell who's calling, then what I do is ask them to give me the numbers of 4 people they might be telepathic with, usually close friends or family members. Imagine you're the subject. You're sitting at home, you have a landline telephone, you're being filmed, so we can be sure you're not getting other phone calls or text messages or emails. We pick one of the 4 callers at random and ask them to call you. Now, you don't know who it's going to be. You can't know from their normal pattern of life because we've picked them at random. So the phone rings. Before you pick it up, you have to say who you think it is. "I think it's Mary," you might say, and then you pick it up and say, "Hi, Mary." You're right or you're wrong. By chance, the chance coincidence theory would say you'd be right 1 time in 4, 25%. In fact, in these experiments, people are right 45% of the time, and it's massively significant statistically with hundreds of trials. Again, I've got one of these experiments online on my website, sheldrake.org, an experiment done for British television with a girl band from the 80s, the Nolan sisters, and they scored 50%. And I now have an automated version of this test, which I'm trying out, the beta version in the UK at present. It's not yet rolled out in the US, but I hope to have it there fairly soon, and details are on my website, sheldrake.org. So this test has now been replicated in Holland at the University of Amsterdam, in Germany at the University of Freiburg, with positive, significant results. So I think telephone telepathy is a real phenomenon. Most people have experienced it. It shows that our intentions, our intention to call somebody, which you have to have before you make the call, can affect people at a distance, just as someone's intention to go home can affect their dog in a measurable, observable way. When I talk to skeptics about this evidence, the people who are psi deniers, people who say these things are impossible, I find that virtually all of them I talk to have simply not seen this evidence. They haven't looked at it. They just mouth their skeptical mantra, these phenomena don't exist, they're just wishful thinking, there's no repeatable research that shows that they exist. There is plenty of repeatable research, it's been repeated, they just don't want to know. It's a kind of denialist attitude, which in my opinion is profoundly unscientific. I think we've reached the very peculiar position today, to summarize all of what I've been saying, that people claim that the consciousness is nothing but the brain, and they claim that in the name of science. And yet, science itself has moved on, and science has now gives us plenty of evidence that consciousness is much more than just the brain. And it's an ironic fact that the people who claim to be defending a scientific worldview show so little interest in science itself. Basically, what it has become is a dogmatic ideology, and I think it's an ideology which is severely holding science back. It's something which is preventing inquiry, inhibiting genuine exploration of consciousness, and is actually pseudo-scientific. It pretends to be scientific, but it's not. And I think actually in the paradigm change that's going on at the moment is a very profound one. It's actually a complete change in the way we see consciousness from the mind is nothing but the brain view, which has dominated science for well over a century, to a much more curious, open-minded investigation of what's really going on.